Just the facts, ma'am.
Hey all, today we're going to talk about nuclear war, and we are going to cover quite a few topics in a short amount of time. We're going to start off with some U.S. government reports on actual survival estimates. Then we're going to look at a test blast map so you know what to expect if a bomb did go off in your area. After that, we're going to look at duck and cover, which actually does work, by the way, and we'll look at some last-minute sheltering options. And finally, we'll take a look at the Russia versus U.S. nuclear weapons capabilities and civil defense plans. For most of us, everything we learned about nukes we learned from the old 1980s movies, and that is not even close to reality, at least not close when you're talking about survival stats. So I hope you find this interesting. Okay, so we're going to be getting our data from this 1988 FEMA report, which seems old, but I believe this is the last report the U.S. government really did on this topic. At least it's the last one I can find. And the data in this report actually comes from a report from 1978. But not a whole lot has changed in the last 40 years, at least not on our side. You can find the links to both of these reports below. Assuming some warning, but otherwise merely a duck and cover civil defense, the chance of injury or death in an NAPB-90 attack are about 1 in 3 being killed outright by blast or thermal effects, and 1 in 25 of being killed by fallout radiation. A smaller percentage would be injured via trauma during the blast itself, but they estimate at least half the population would be completely uninjured. To clarify, a duck and cover civil defense means there are no fallout shelters, people are just sheltering in their homes. And an NAPB-90 attack is basically the worst case scenario, which the report acknowledges is not very likely. That would be Russia hitting us with 6,000 different warheads, including all the missile silos, Air Force bases, Navy bases, political infrastructure, ports, petroleum refineries, power stations, chemical facilities, and so on. And that just isn't realistic for a variety of reasons. First of all, a couple of high-altitude EMPs would take out all the civilian infrastructure anyways, so there's no point in bombing the power stations and the ports, and that would just be a waste. Secondly, Russia plans to win and survive a nuclear war, so they're not going to be wasting any warheads unnecessarily, because when they're done with us, they might have to handle that uppity NATO. This report also includes a timeline of obstacles. So the first 1 to 2 days, the biggest obstacle would obviously be the actual bombs going off and the resulting fire, which would be a bigger deal in areas like California where fires tend to rage out of control. The first 1 to 7 days, fallout radiation is a big concern, and people may be surprised by that short window. There's a few reasons for that. First off, we don't want to confuse nuclear reactors melting down with nuclear weapons. They're two totally different things. Secondly, most of the bombs will be airburst, which creates much less fallout. Some of the bombs, if they're trying to blow up something underground, like bunkers or missiles and silos underground, those will be ground burst. That will create more fallout. But basically a ground burst weapon, it digs out a big crater of soil, shoots it up into the atmosphere, and then that soil comes back down on top of you in the form of radioactive fallout. In addition, most of the radioactive elements, they do degrade pretty darn quick. If you look up the rule of sevens, you'll see that even just 49 hours after the blast, the radioactivity in much of the fallout has reduced to about 1% of the original amount. There will be exceptions, like for instance, cattle grazing on grass. They are susceptible to radiation poisoning for a much longer period of time. That's primarily because they're actually eating radiation and fallout in the grass itself. So the first 2 to 7 days, people will be trapped in the rubble of the actual blast zone. And the first 5 to 50 days, life support inadequacies, which basically means there won't be any food or water for the majority of people. And the rest of the list is either due to the breakdown of society or its long-term effects. They say that long-term, if you survive the blast and the fallout, of course you're going to have increased cancer risks, primarily in the form of thyroid cancer, leukemia, and bone cancer. But that's only going to affect some people, and they say on average our life expectancies might be shortened by about 5 years. The better shelter you have and the longer you shelter, the better chance you have of not developing cancer down the road. So now let's take a look at the actual blast radius and effects. And we're going to use Washington, D.C. as our test site. We're going to hit it with a Russian Topol missile, which is about 800 kilotons. And that's a good mid-sized missile that would probably be in the right range for a city or various military complexes. And it is going to be airburst. The tiny little yellow dot in the very center, that is going to get hit by the fireball from the actual blast. That is about a half a mile across, and everything in that little yellow circle is going to be completely vaporized. The blue-gray area, the circle outside of that, approximately 4 miles wide, that is basically going to be flattened by the pressure of the blast. So most buildings, depending on construction, are going to be blown to the ground and completely destroyed. And this footage is actually from the tests they did in Nevada back in the 1950s. And as you can see, the buildings close to the blast are completely demolished. And that last outside yellow ring, the biggest threat there is primarily thermal radiation burns, which isn't quite as bad as it sounds. That type of radiation is easily blocked by clothing or a sheet of paper, and that is really the duck and cover zone. The moment you see that flash, you duck and you cover. Cover your skin, get behind something in case that there is debris from buildings being destroyed coming your way. If you can avoid being burned by the flash, if you can avoid trauma from flying debris, your chance of survival is pretty darn good. At that point, if you're in one piece after the blast, you've got about 10 minutes to take shelter in a fallout shelter or whatever is available that's close at hand. And the reason that's the case is because the bomb just kicked all this dust up into the air. All that dust is going to come straight down on top of you in the form of radioactive fallout in about 10-15 minutes. So if you're in a big city, you could look at obviously basements, underground parking garages, the mid-levels of high-rise buildings, and that works because it puts distance between you and the fallout that's going to land on the roof and on the ground. Most people will be sheltering in their homes or apartments or office buildings. We saw the stats. Most people are not going to die from the fallout. Just do not ingest it, do not breathe it. Try to seal the windows up. Packages, food and water that do not get dust in them are perfectly safe to consume. If you don't have water stored, you better get some out of the pipes real quick before the pressure drops. Otherwise, you could be drinking out of the toilet tank. So, the numbers show that most would in fact survive a nuclear war and the radiation, if their country has a civil defense plan. If your government is incompetent, then the majority of the population will die of starvation, violence, and disease. But before we get into that, let's take a look at what Russia has been up to for the last 40 years. Russia has always placed priority on their nuclear weapons program, and if anything, that has increased since the dissolution of the Soviet Union, primarily because Russia is now a much smaller country that they could not win a ground war with another superpower like the United States or if NATO attacked them. So they've continued to develop their weapons, and they've come up with some really very effective things. That has actually the positive benefit of reducing the fallout risk and things like that, because the weapons have such better aiming capabilities. They can use smaller warheads to accurately blast targets.
Боевой ракетный комплекс шахтного базирования Тополь-М.
Now we know they have at least one ICBM that has 6 individual warheads on it. This article says in the mid-2000s it came out with another one that has 10 individual warheads, meaning the ICBM comes across, it breaks into 10 separate warheads. Each one can seek their own target. Supposedly they have evasive maneuvering capabilities so that they can avoid our missile defense systems. And it goes on to say that China has developed a similar platform. The U.S. simply has no way to defend against a salvo of such devastating nukes. Now, in comparison, the U.S. stopped the nuclear weapons program development in the 1970s. The last ICBM produced was the U.S. Minuteman III, which has 1 warhead on it. In addition, Russia has made a large part of their nuclear arsenal mobile, because if a war broke out, the first objective is always to blow up your enemy's missiles and warheads so they can't strike back. So Russia moves a good part of their arsenal around. They haul them around on trucks. They've got them popping out of train cars. Of course, they've got some in silos. They've got them on submarines. There's no way for the U.S. to pinpoint where most of their arsenal even is at this point. All the U.S. missiles are still in underground silos, with the exception of a few that are on nuclear submarines or go onto aircraft. And the silos are really, really old. They look like museum pieces from 1962. All the phones and equipment is the original, except they're rusting. I think some of the missiles are rusting as well. So everyone knows exactly where to hit on a first strike to take out our capabilities. Although, can you even imagine if we had nukes floating around on trucks or train cars in the U.S.? Oh, that would turn into an immediate disaster. In addition, Russia has always had a strong civil defense program. You probably followed the news and saw the news last October, they were talking about their huge national civil defense drills. They do those every year. They have fallout shelters for most of their population. They have food supplies in place to feed their population if a war broke out and they were devastated by nukes and it took them a few months to get up and running again. They take this very seriously, and they always have. Now, remember that old report from the 1970s that I mentioned and how I said nothing has really changed? Well, it really hasn't. The whole purpose of that report, and the report that came out in '88, was we could survive a nuclear war if we had a civil defense plan. So, let's look at the conclusions found in that '78 report. The lack of realistic plans to reorganize and manage surviving resources would be the Achilles heel. In other words, surviving resources, food, water. And number 3, it is concluded from the current level of effort in the face of a problem which would undoubtedly dwarf all other disasters that the United States simply rejects the possibility of a nuclear war. Not so the Soviet Union, which is making extensive preparations to survive, win, and recover if a nuclear war should occur. In the 1950s, the U.S. government did have a pretty strong civil defense program. I believe they had something like 100,000 fallout shelters in various communities, and that included 2 weeks' worth of emergency food supplies and water, medical supplies. They turned out a lot of educational material, telling people how to deal with catastrophes such as nuclear war. And then in 1964, all that changed. The feds decided they didn't want to do it anymore. They turned it over to the states. Well, as soon as the food expired in a few years, the states didn't have any money to buy more. The feds said they're not spending another dime on it, and that was the end of the U.S. Civil Defense Program. But of course, there are luxury shelters for the government employees. Huge underground fallout shelters that can house thousands of them. They do have money to spend on that. Then a few years later, all these scary nuclear war movies started coming out, convincing the public that it was impossible to survive. Life on Earth would end if there was a nuclear war, or alternatively, the tiny percentage that would survive would wish they were dead. And that's, I would say, probably 90% of Americans at least still believe that today. So I hope you found this information interesting. Please note this is not intended to be a survival guide. This is just to give you a bird's eye view of nuclear war. I do have some links below, including a link to the free downloadable book, Nuclear War Survival Skills, which is excellent. So if you want to learn more, look at the links below. I do appreciate you taking the time to watch this video, and if you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Thank you so much, and stay safe.